We're now going to hear a talk about a very different conception of prime matter as found in Thomas Aquinas. It will be presented by my distinguished Hoosier colleague. You may not know what that means, and in fact, it's not determinate what it does mean. But in fact, Jeff is at Purdue University, and he has already published a book on the subject he's going to introduce us to here, or at least it looks to me like that. It's called Aquinas' Ontology of the Material World, Change, Homomorphism, and Material Objects. So perhaps he's going to further advance our understanding, and he's going to share his screen so that we'll be able to follow through on a PowerPoint presentation.
Thanks, Riga. I'm very glad to be a part of this project that Nicola has organized and to get to talk to you, such a distinguished audience, and be a part of such a distinguished panel to talk to you about Aquinas' views on the topic. I distributed a handout in advance, which contains the material I'll cover in a static form, but as Riga mentioned, I'm going to try to share my screen here, and can you see that?
Yes,
okay,
you can see
so
it.
this is a PowerPoint presentation that contains the same information, but in a more dynamic form. So my job was to talk to you about, to introduce you to Aquinas' views about prime matter. And so I'm going to try to do that in a way that I hope will not only clarify, but maybe help to dispel some of the mystery surrounding them. My experience in talking about prime matter is that people want to believe that the mystery cannot be dispelled. And so that makes this difficult. There's something, at least in contemporary philosophers, that make them want to find prime matter mysterious, and among medievals to find Aquinas' own views. So we'll see how it goes. I think Aquinas' views can be usefully summarized in terms of three theses. The first there has to do with the reality or existence of prime matter. The second two theses have to do with its nature, one saying what it's not, another saying what it is. And I think it's pretty clear that Aquinas commits himself to each of these. We'll see texts that certainly suggest this. But there is a puzzle about how to understand Aquinas' commitment to these theses and the relationship to one another, especially when we consider them in connection with two Aristotelian assumptions that he also commits himself to. So, as I say, I think there can be little doubt that he commits himself to the existence of prime matter. But when you combine that with the first thesis about its nature, that it's neither a substance nor an accident, it's a bit hard to understand how that's compatible with his broadly Aristotelian commitment to what I've called A1. Whatever exists must belong to one of the 10 categories, and so it would seem to be a substance or an accident. In addition to saying that, though, he also says that prime matter is pure potentiality. This is perhaps the distinguishing feature of his view, or at least what's often associated specifically with him. But given that he also holds that whatever exists must have actuality, it's a bit hard to see how that's compatible with the conjunction of T3 and T1. So there's some puzzles here. This leaves us, I guess, with two main interpretive options. One is just to grant that there is a genuine inconsistency here, and so Aquinas' views are incoherent. This is a kind of strategy that it was standard for some of Aquinas' near contemporary successors and even followers to say. In particular, they didn't like his claim that prime matter is pure potentiality and thought that should be given up. I want to take the other option, which is to insist that these are genuinely consistent, and hence that Aquinas' views are coherent. So I want to defend the coherence of Aquinas' views, and I want to do that by basically clarifying what I take to be the proper understanding of those three Thomistic theses, and their relationship to those two assumptions via a close examination of the role that prime matter plays in change. So I'll be taking what we might call a physical approach, looking at what we can learn from Aquinas' views about physics or change. And I take this approach because I think it's the one that represents Aquinas' own. As he says in that passage I've quoted there, he thinks matter can only be known in itself through change. And it's for this reason that its study belongs chiefly to physics. Okay, so I'll basically be taking up each of these theses one at a time, beginning with the connection between prime matter and change and what that tells us about its existence. And here I want to focus on this text, which I've given you on the handout, text A, which is a text from the Metaphysics, but Aquinas is here summarizing what he takes to be Aristotle's physical argument for prime matter. So in the very first sentence we get, in the case of sensible substances, Aristotle claims that it's necessary to posit matter as a subject and quasi-substance. And then he goes on to explain. And there's a lot going on in this passage. I'm not going to read the whole passage. I'll be coming back to little bits of it. But what I want to do to start is just focus on three claims. The first main claim in each of the paragraphs that follow. And if we focus on just those three claims, I think we can begin to see Aquinas' argument for the existence of prime matter based on change. So in the very first sentence, we get the claim that every change requires a subject. There must be a subject for any type of change that exists. He then goes on to point out that substantial change exists, and for this reason, there must be a subject for substantial change. In that final sentence, he goes on to tell us that this provides us the main reason for thinking that there is prime matter, which suggests that he's taking for granted that prime matter just is the subject for substantial change. And if all that's right, we get the conclusion that prime matter exists. I call this the argument for substantial change for obvious reasons. And what I want to do is briefly look through this argument and consider the evidence he gives for each of these premises. So first, there must be a subject for any type of change that exists. Aquinas thinks this follows from the nature of change. As he sees it, there can be no change without something that is changed, and then he just calls that the subject. And he takes it that when a subject's changed, it exists in different states at different times. It comes to be in a new state. For some reason, I'm having a little trouble here advancing this. I'm going to put a couple texts here. The first one just suggests that there's got to be something that exists in different states at different times. This is part of the very meaning of change. And the next passage, he tells us it's part of the concept of change that one and the same thing exists in different states. And the fact that there's a subject, he thinks, is precisely what distinguishes change from creation. In change, you have to have one thing existing in different states at different times. That's not the case in creation. The thing can just come into existence out of nothing. Okay, so let's see here. The first premise follows from the nature of change. What about the second premise, that substantial change exists? Well, in general, Aquinas thinks we know about the existence of change on the basis of perception, or the senses. In his arguments for the existence of God, for example, he relies on this sort of knowledge. He says, for example, it's certain and obvious to the senses that some things in this world are changed. Look around and you can see it. And I think he thinks the same is true for different types of change, and so applies not only to accidental changes or changes involving a pre-existing substance that changes with respect to one of its accidents, but also for changes that by which substances come into or go out of existence. And it might help here just to say a little bit about how Aquinas is thinking about different types of change. Obviously, there's a distinction between substantial and accidental change, and this is closely connected to his views about the categories. In fact, he thinks in principle there can be changes in each of the 10 Aristotelian categories, and so just as many general types, 1 substantial and 9 accidental. That said, he thinks that all categorical changes can ultimately be explained in terms of 4 fundamental, or as he puts it, per se types. So there's changes in the category of substance. He calls these generation and corruption. There's changes in the category of quality. He calls these alteration. Changes in the category of quantity. He calls these augmentation. And changes in the category of location or place. He calls these locomotion. So although he allows in principle for 10 different types, 1 substantial and 9 accidental, he ultimately thinks these can all be explained in terms of 1 substantial and 3 types of accidental change. And then actually, if we go back to the 2nd and 3rd paragraphs of that key text, it's interesting to note that he runs through all these different types of per se change, though in the reverse order. So when he says there must be a subject for any type of change, he says, so in change of place, there's a subject that's first at one location and then at another. In augmentation, one that's a certain size and later a different size, alteration, and so on. So there must be one for generation and corruption. Okay, so we've got the first 2 premises. That gives us our initial conclusion. There must be a subject for substantial change. And as I pointed out, he takes this little argument here to generate the conclusion that prime matter exists. In fact, he says here, this is the main source from which we derive our knowledge of prime matter. And so, So as I say, he must be assuming that prime matter is the subject of substantial change. And given that he doesn't say much more here, it might seem that this is at least partly stipulative. We'll see there's more to be said here, but this is partly stipulative. And so we get the conclusion that prime matter exists, and that's just our first thesis. Okay, so much for the first thesis. I now want to begin to turn to questions about the nature. So up till now, we've been focusing on the question, does prime matter exist? And now we're going to turn to questions of the form, what is it? Quid est? And Aquinas interestingly thinks that you can't answer questions about the nature of prime matter until you've established that it exists. In fact, in general, he wants to say questions of the form quid est come after you have answers to questions of the form on est. But that might seem initially puzzling. I mean, after all, the argument for substantial change seems to tell us an answer to the question, what is prime matter? It's a subject for substantial change. But as I say, that's partly stipulative, and you don't get the nature of something from stipulation. But what's interesting is this description tells us something about the meaning of the name, or better, it gives us some understanding of substantial change via the functional role that it plays. In fact, I think what the argument from substantial change shows us is that prime matter is something that plays the role of a subject in change, and in substantial change in particular. That by itself leaves open the nature of prime matter. It says it's got to be something that plays this role, but we don't yet know what the nature of that thing is. Even so, Aquinas does think we can draw some inferences about the nature of prime matter by thinking about what must be true of the role player. So here's a text in which he says, in generation, the matter or subject persists. And it doesn't just persist in any old way, it persists, it permanet, it persists in the way a permanent being does. It's not a successive being. It doesn't exist at different times in virtue of having a part at those different times. The whole of it exists at the different times associated with the change. And so he thinks we can draw the conclusion from this that it's a permanent being. Okay, so we do get some idea of what prime matter is, both in terms of its functional role and its nature. If this is all there were to the functional role and nature of prime matter, then it might be puzzling why he doesn't just refer to prime matter as a subject or a permanent being. Why refer to it as a type of matter? It turns out this isn't all that can be said, and when we see what more can be said, in particular, the different ways in which we can further specify the functional role and draw further conclusions about the nature of prime matter, we'll see the appropriateness of the sort of hylomorphic language. In order to see this, though, what more can be said about the functional role and nature of prime matter, we need to come back to what he says about change and look at it in a little more detail. So initially, when we were talking about the nature of change, we focused on the fact that it involves a subject existing in different states at different times. But if we return to that text, that first line of the second paragraph that I started with, and don't stop with what it says about subject, but read on, we'll see that change involves more than just a subject existing in different or even contrary states. It also involves some termini associated with those different states. So to fill out what we've got here, Aquinas wants to say, not just that every change requires a subject, but some termini. And I think the point is, it not only requires something that's changed, but some things with respect to which it changes. So to use one of his favorite examples, if we've got a lump that changes its shape, the shapes will serve as the termini. And as this shows, a thing changes not just by existing in different states at different times, but by being differently related. In fact, you might say it exists in different states and different times by virtue of being differently related to the termini of change. And this little complication or addition, I think, allows us to complicate our understanding of the types of change. So change in general requires not only a subject and a pair of states, but also a pair of termini. And in the case of the three per se types of accidental change, I think it's pretty clear what the termini are. In locomotion, as we've seen, we get a substance or a body changing its location, existing in different states of being located somewhere. And that's because it's differently related to places. And in the case of the other two types of accidental change, the termini are quantities and qualities. Okay, but how are we to think of the termini associated with substantial change? Well, Aquinas tells us in paragraph 3, referring to the subject of substantial change, he says, and this subject, whose termini are form and privation, is such that sometimes it has actuality through the form and other times is merely a subject of the privation of that form. Where I take it the idea is the termini involve forms, or at least a form, and its privation. And so for the same reason, the states involve different kinds of states of form possession. It goes from possessing a form to lacking it. Okay, and what this, I think, tells us is that we can further specify the functional role associated with prime matter. Prime matter is not just what plays the role of a subject in change, it's something that plays the role of a subject, of a form. And that by itself, I think, helps to make sense of why we would refer to this subject as matter, because form is always the form of some matter. And it also, I think, helps to explain Aquinas' talk of compounds, and in particular, the generation of compounds or destruction of compounds in substantial change, because when matter takes on a form or ceases to possess some form, we have different states of a compound, their generation or corruption. Okay, so I think this further specification of the functional role of prime matter also allows us to further specify its nature. It's not merely a permanent being, it's a substratum of a certain kind. It's a subject of a form and hence a substratum for a compound. All right, so we've got some, I think, further understanding of why this subject gets talked about in terms of a type of matter. Why refer to it as prime matter? Well, here I think we need to take into account something that he doesn't emphasize, Aquinas doesn't emphasize in passage A, and that is that the matter and form and compounds associated with substantial change are not the only types of matter, form, and compound. In particular, Aquinas is happy to refer to quantities and qualities as forms. But if that's right, then we need some way to distinguish the forms involved in substantial change from those involved with accidental change. And Aquinas does this in creative fashion by referring to the forms involved with substantial change as substantial forms. And he often calls the ones associated with augmentation and alteration accidental forms, but that word is too big to fit in that box, so I'll just leave it as forms. This allows us to give an even further specification of the functional role of prime matter. It's not just what plays the subject or even a subject of a form in substantial change, it's what plays this role of a subject of substantial form. And I think that allows us to further understand why he introduced this term prime matter, insofar as the subject of an accidental change is the subject of a form. It counts as matter, but since it's only the subject of a substantial change that's a subject for the most basic type of form, that we refer to it as prime matter. And also, since Aquinas is happy to talk about the subject and termini of accidental changes involving matter and form, and also in certain contexts generating or corrupting accidental compounds, it makes sense for him also to single out the type of compounds involved in substantial change as sensible substances or bodies. And so this gives us one further specification of the nature of prime matter. It's not merely a permanent being, not merely a substratum, but a substratum for a sensible substance. And that turns out to be important, as we'll see here shortly. Okay, so if we come back to the second Thomistic thesis in light of what we've just seen, I think we can begin to understand why Aquinas would think this second thesis is true. So here's a little table that kind of summarizes what we've said about the functional role and nature of prime matter and draws out some implications. So the most general specification of the functional role of prime matter is in terms of a subject of change. And we've seen that that must be a permanent being. But that implies it's not a successive being, so it can't be associated with time or motion or any of the categories associated with those. But as we've seen, we can further specify the functional role in terms of a subject of a form, which leads us to understanding its nature in terms of a substratum for a compound. But a substratum is not itself a form, it's the bearer of a form. And so it's not itself an accident, but the subject of an accident. And finally, when we get the most specific, at least to date, specification of the functional role in terms of the subject of a substantial form, that helps us to see that it's a substratum for a sensible substance. And as Aquinas sees it, no substance can be composed of another substance. And so this implies that prime matter is not a substance or a compound either. But of course, if that's right, then it's going to follow that T2 is true. It's not a substance nor an accident. And in fact, Aquinas, there was that little passage that summarized what I called the physical approach at the beginning. Immediately after telling us that we can only understand matter through change, he points out that it's for this reason that the philosopher Aristotle comes to his famous characterization of prime matter as neither a what, nor a quality, nor something belonging to any of the other categories by which being is divided or made determinate. So here we get a kind of explication of why it is that Aquinas holds this second thesis, and moreover thinks that it follows from Aristotle's own way of thinking about prime matter. There's still the question, though, about how is this supposed to fit with that second, that first assumption that whatever exists belongs to one of the 10 categories. There was one other thing I was going to point out. Aquinas, in the very beginning of that passage, talks about prime matter as a quasi-substance. So it's not itself a substance, but it's a quasi-substance. And I think we can now see why. And that's because the functional role it's playing is like the role that a substance plays in the case of, say, an alteration. Okay. But what I wanted to call your attention to was a text that kind of gives us some indication of Aquinas's complicated views about the categories. These are not unique to him, but it was standard among medieval philosophers, at least of the High Middle Ages, to allow that things can belong to categories in different ways. As they see it, Aristotle's discussion of hylomorphism in the physics complicates his discussion in the categories or in the logical writings. So in particular, it introduces a kind of complexity that's ignored there. The substances, which are the primary basis of classification of categorical classification turn out to have hylomorphic components. And what do we say about those? Well, like other folks, Aquinas is happy to say they can be traced back or placed in particular categories, at least in a kind of reductive way. So if that's right, then I think we can see how we not only get a clarification of those first two Thomistic theses. Prime matter exists. In fact, it exists as a substratum for sensible substances, but it's neither a substance nor an accident, and hence doesn't belong to any of the 10 Aristotelian categories in the direct way. They're not one of the things that are primarily classified. What gets primarily classified are substances, and their parts, whether hylomorphic or other parts like hands, are going to have to be understood as parts of the primary things there. And so I think the way he's understanding that Aristotelian assumption is, yeah, everything must belong to one of the 10 categories in some way or other, but they don't all have to belong to it in the direct or primary way that complete substances or their attributes do. Okay, so much for the first two Thomistic theses. What about the third? As I've said, this is often taken to be the most distinctive one. Certainly the one that created the most controversy in Aquinas' own time. But for our purposes, I think it's helpful to ask, what, if anything, does this add to what we've seen so far? What's the point of this description or this characterization? And what I want to eventually suggest is this gives us the most complete description of the functional role of prime matter, and so gives us, in a way, some of the deepest insight into its nature. In order to see, though, what this thesis is saying, I think we need to get clear about how Aquinas is thinking of the connection between matter in general and prime matter in particular to potentiality. My thing is not responding. Okay, so first I want to call your attention to this text that I have here at H. And what the text basically does is says, just as form is closely connected to actuality, matter is closely connected to potentiality. Now, if you look at the last sentence there, it's clear that he thinks form can be straightforwardly identified with actuality. It's because form makes something actual that it gets called an actuality. Commentators often speak as if matter were just to be identified with potentiality in the same way that form is identified with actuality. But I think if you look at the beginning of the sentence, you'll see that's not true. It's not potentiality that's matter, but anything that exists in potentiality. So matter is not potentiality, but a being or entity in potentiality. And Aquinas, in fact, makes this perfectly explicit himself in another place. He says in this snippet from the commentary on De Anima, there's a difference between matter and form. Matter is a being in potentiality, ends in potentia, whereas form is an actuality, actus, by which matter, or the potentiality of matter, is actualized. For the same reason, it's the compound itself that's the being in actuality. So you got some bronze, it's potentially shaped in a certain way. You add the actuality or the shape, and then you get a being that's shaped in some way, which is the compound. Okay, so here I think is the way to think about the relationship of hylomorphism to potentiality and actuality for Aquinas. Matter is a being in potentiality, form is an actuality, and the compound is the being in actuality that results from the compound of matter and form. And then I've given a little diagram here just to illustrate it. Okay, so far so good. So I think we can think of, in a way, the notion of being in potentiality is explicating the notion of matter, actuality explicating form, and being in actuality explicating compound. All right, but how does this then relate to prime matter and pure potentiality? Well, here, I guess I did think that it would be useful to clarify that Thomistic thesis, just to make clear that prime matter is not being identified with pure potentiality, but a being that exists in pure potentiality. How does this all relate to prime matter and pure potentiality? Well, here's a useful passage which I think gives us some insight. Aquinas tells us here in this passage from second chapter of De Principiis, it must be known that some matter, for example, bronze, is composed of matter and form. For even though bronze is matter in respect of a statue, it is itself composed of matter and form, and so is a compound. Now, because bronze has matter and form, it's not called prime matter. On the contrary, only that matter which is understood without any form and privation and yet serves as the subject for form and privation is called prime matter. So I think the point here is, suppose we plug in bronze for our matter here, our being and potentiality, a shape for our form or actuality, and a statue for our compound. We can clearly see that the bronze is matter relative to the statue and to the form that serves as its shape. But as he points out, the bronze is also a compound of some matter and form, and its matter is prime matter, which again will be a being and potentiality relative to it, and the subject of a substantial form. And what that shows us is, in the case of bronze, it's not merely a being and potentiality, it's a being and potentiality relative to the statue. It's the matter of the statue. But it's also a being in actuality. It's a compound relative to its own matter. And if you keep that in mind, I think we can see why Aquinas would call prime matter pure potentiality, or a being in pure potentiality, because it's a being in potentiality and not a being in actuality. That is to say, it's a subject, but not a compound. It's not itself composed of any matter and form. Okay, so I think this allows us to further clarify that third Thomistic thesis. Prime matter is a being in pure potentiality, and to call it a being in pure potentiality is to tell us it doesn't have any actuality as a constituent. And this way it's different from bronze. But if that's right, then I think we can see how it compares or is compatible with that second Aristotelian assumption. What that assumption is designed to tell us is whatever exists must have actuality in some way or other. Sorry, I'm not sure why this is having trouble. So these texts somehow got skipped. If you look at K there, this shows that Aquinas is thinking of being as connected with something that exists in actuality. You only get a being when you've got something that exists in actuality. And then the two passages there, I think, also make clear that prime matter is not being said. When Aquinas says prime matter is not a being in actuality, he's not denying that it has actuality in some way. He's denying that it has actuality through itself. Prime matter, as he says in Im, can never exist through itself. Indeed, since it doesn't have any form in its nature, in its essence, in what it is in itself, it doesn't have being in actuality in itself, but only in potentiality, since being in actuality only comes through a form. Okay, if all that's right, I think we can see how these two things are compatible. When Aquinas says that prime matter exists, he's saying it has actuality. When he claims that it's a being in pure potentiality, he's denying that it has actuality in a certain way, namely as a constituent, or in the way, say, some bronze does. Okay, there's still the question of what does this claim about prime matter being a being in pure potentiality add to what we've seen so far, in particular in connection with what T2 tells us about the nature of prime matter? Well, there's that little chart which gives us increasing specifications of the functional role and nature of prime matter and its implications. I think what's being added by T3 is a further specification. In fact, what I would say is the most complete specification, provided we think each specification as including those that go before it. To call prime matter a being in pure potentiality, as I've said, is to say that it has its actuality only through another. And since actuality is what's required to exist, that makes it a radically dependent substratum. And so what T3 adds is this: prime matter is not only a substratum for a sensible substance, it's such that it cannot exist alone. And Aquinas, I think, himself suggests this in several passages. He often contrasts God and prime matter as on different metaphysical poles. God is pure actuality, where that indicates he's totally independent. Prime matter is pure potentiality, which is to say radically dependent. And then there's the famous account of not even God can create prime matter alone. And as he tells us in quote libet 3, and here I've taken from the Sed Contra, but this specifies in a very simple way the view that Aquinas goes on to defend there. The existence of matter without form implies a contradiction, since the existence of matter implies its actuality, which is a form. Therefore, God can't make matter exist without a form. Okay, so the conclusion is Aquinas' 3 Thomistic theses can be filled out in the way that I've suggested. And once they are so filled out, we can understand their compatibility with those 3 assumptions. The one other thing I wanted to mention was, I think one strategy contemporary commentators sometimes adopt when it comes to understanding these 3 theses is to try to give some kind of non-robust interpretation of the existence of prime matter. So Bob Pass now wants to suggest, and has suggested in a couple of different places, that we can say prime matter exists, and then he gives an account of why Aquinas would talk this way. But really, material beings are not composites of actuality plus some kind of elusive stuff. I really wish he had said substrate there, and then this would be the most appropriate text. But what I want to suggest is, on my interpretation, they're all taken robustly. Prime matter really does exist as a genuine entity, a substratum, and so on. But his views are still perfectly consistent with these 2 assumptions. Okay, thank you.